President Trump, Governor Walker, and House Speaker Paul Ryan joined Foxconn executives for the ceremonial groundbreaking of the company's planned $10 billion tech campus in Mount Pleasant, which could employ 13,000 people. At that event, Trump praised Walker for his work on the Foxconn deal, but Thursday's celebration followed days of Trump blasting Harley-Davidson on Twitter. Walker, who is up for re-election and a Harley rider, has been quiet about the president attacking a Wisconsin company. He also declined to weigh in on the president's controversial immigration policy. We're talking about the relationship between the governor and the president with Jessie Opoien, who covers politics for the Capital Times. She's at our Madison affiliate, WKOW-TV. Jessie, it's good to have you back on the program. And let's begin with a quick stroll down memory lane and remember how the president, for example, talked about Scott Walker during the 2016 presidential campaign. He's not always been kind to the governor.
He has not. Thanks for having me on, Mike. If you'll recall, those of us who were following Scott Walker's presidential campaign, he dropped out of the race, basically asking his counterparts to coalesce around any candidate who wasn't Donald Trump. He was very reluctant and late to endorse Donald Trump, and because of that, when the president came here before he was elected to campaign in Wisconsin, he didn't have kind words for Scott Walker. He talked about the state's economy. He blamed troubles on Scott Walker. He even made fun of him, saying he didn't really look like a Harley rider to him. It took a while before the two of them could really mend fences, but since President Trump was elected, Scott Walker's been pretty reluctant to criticize him in most cases. And we saw yesterday, or rather on Thursday this week, we saw the president with some very kind words for Scott Walker, talking about this Foxconn deal, saying, this is a special man, he's a special talent. Only he, of all the governors, could have taken this deal and made it possible and made it happen. And the two of them were side by side, grinning on stage together like all was forgotten.
Yeah, it was quite a contrast. And I want to pick up on something you just mentioned there, that the governor has been reluctant to criticize the president. He didn't weigh in on, for example, the immigration policy, the Trump immigration policy. He did not directly weigh in on what he thought the president should or shouldn't have said about Harley-Davidson. First of all, you cover the governor on a regular basis. How unusual is it for him to not weigh in on, for example, national issues?
Well, it's an interesting needle that he tries to thread on this, because he certainly, when Barack Obama was in office, was ready and willing to criticize the Affordable Care Act, willing to criticize environmental policies. He's backed the state, suing against the federal government on several of these issues, but since Trump has taken office, he's taken more of a tack of saying, he's the governor of Wisconsin, he's not going to comment on federal issues, and then finding a way to justify the federal issues that he will comment on. So we saw this really put to the test in recent weeks when he's been willing to talk about tariffs, as that is an issue that really will directly affect Wisconsin, but he is less willing to talk about immigration policy, which one could argue also affects the state of Wisconsin, but it's a touchier subject. So I think what we've seen the governor do is talk about the president when he can point to a tangible benefit, but try to shy away when he can't tie it back to Wisconsin in a real way for people.
Are we to assume that in this election year that the governor will be careful in the way he speaks of the president from this point forward?
I think that's safe to assume. He has said that he would appear with the president if he were to come here to campaign in Wisconsin. He's also said he doesn't expect the president to campaign for him, but maybe to campaign for someone else on the ballot. I think he's going to keep walking that line as long as he can point to something that has a tangible benefit for the state of Wisconsin, which we can argue is the case with something like the Foxconn groundbreaking. He'll be a little more willing to talk about that. I think when the president makes controversial remarks, when he tweets anything, for instance, or when he starts talking about threats to Harley-Davidson, he's going to find a way to shy away from that.
Jessie Opoien is of the Capital Times. She is with us today from our satellite, our sister station in Madison. Jessie, we appreciate your time. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks, Mike.
Still ahead, why Foxconn isn't just an issue in this year's race for governor.